welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're stepping into the classroom, but maybe not in the way you usually think about it. We're looking at it as, well, a really complex psychosocial ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. It's dynamic.
Right, and the way students and teachers interact, it's much more intricate, more reciprocal than we often give it credit for.
That's the core of it.
So our mission in this deep dive is to explore that whole fascinating two-way psychological dance. You know, how a student's inner world actually shapes their teacher's approach. And just as importantly, how a teacher's psychology really influences student behavior, their performance, everything.
And for this deep dive, we've gathered quite a range of sources. We're talking empirical studies, established psychological theories, real classroom data, even some cutting-edge neuroscience.
Wow, quite the mix.
Yeah, and all of it really points to how these emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and even, neurobiological factors on both sides play a huge role in the learning environment. So this deep dive should give you a good shortcut to understanding this really crucial relationship.
Okay, let's start with something that sounds, well, really intriguing. This idea that students actually actively shape their teachers. You kind of think it's mostly the other way around, right?
You do, typically.
But it starts with just the emotional climate in the room, like when students are genuinely engaged, curious, maybe managing their emotions well. What does that do to the teacher?
Well, it creates this incredibly powerful positive feedback loop. When a teacher sees students leaning in, asking questions, responding positively, it's not just a nice feeling in the moment.
It's more than that.
Oh, yeah. Research shows that positive energy can sort of subtly rewire a teacher's brain over time. It boosts their professional self-efficacy, their belief in their own ability to teach effectively.
Okay.
And it even builds resilience against future challenges. It can fundamentally shift their long-term approach, making them, more enthusiastic, more patient, more creative in how they teach.
That's a really profound connection there. But what happens when that engagement isn't there, or worse, when students are disruptive?
Right, and the contrast is pretty stark, honestly. When you have, say, a lot of disruptive behavior, or even just persistent apathy from students, it can unfortunately trigger a very different outcome for teachers.
Like what?
Significant stress, burnout, and what researchers sometimes call defensive teaching behaviors.
Defensive teaching, what does that look like?
Well, think about it this way. Teachers are constantly evaluating student behavior and their own ability to influence it. If they start to feel powerless or like the situation is just uncontrollable.
Their stress response kicks in.
Exactly. And that can show up as these defensive behaviors, things like maybe oversimplifying the content, sticking really rigidly to the lesson plan, or becoming overly strict just to maintain order, instead of fostering actual deep learning.
Got it. And building on that sort of reciprocal influence, let's look at the growth mindset idea. How can a student's belief that abilities can be developed, how does that reshape a teacher's approach?
Yeah, the growth mindset angle is fascinating. When students show perseverance or take initiative or just generally embrace that idea that effort matters, they're essentially sending a signal to the teacher.
What kind of signal?
A signal that the teacher's efforts can actually make a difference, that they can yield results. And studies show the student mindset genuinely increases teacher persistence and how much they invest.
So the teacher tries harder because they see the student trying.
Precisely. Teachers become more likely to use what we call mastery-oriented strategies like scaffolding, building up support, then removing it, or providing really specific ongoing feedback. This happens especially when students show that internal intrinsic motivation.
Interesting.
And meta-analyses back this up. Student motivation doesn't just influence their own academic choices, it impacts the teacher's emotional energy, their emotional labor, and how they differentiate instruction for different kids.
Okay, so beyond those immediate emotional and motivational links, there's another way students shape things, right? Through their cultural and identity signals. Things like language, dress, interaction styles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is huge. And it requires teachers to practice what's known as cultural responsiveness. Meaning really seeing and valuing the cultural identity each student brings. If teachers fail to acknowledge that or misunderstand it, it can easily lead to misinterpreting behavior, maybe underestimating a student's ability.
And damage the relationship.
Exactly. It weakens that crucial teacher-student bond. But conversely, teachers who are culturally attuned, they're just much better at reading student needs accurately and adapting how they teach. That way, every student feels seen and understood.
Okay, so now let's flip the script. Let's look at how powerful the teacher's psychology is in shaping the students, starting with something called emotional contagion. Sounds infectious.
It kind of is, in a way. It's a really powerful concept. Basically, a teacher's emotional state directly influences the students.
Yeah.
You often see the students' mood, their engagement levels. They start mirroring the teacher's feelings.
How does that work? Is it just observation?
Well, it's partly observation, but it's also supported by our neurobiology, specifically our mirror neuron systems. You can think of them as our brain's sort of like emotional Wi-Fi. Right? They help create this synchronized emotional environment. When we see someone experiencing an emotion, parts of our brain can actually mirror that feeling. So what this means in the classroom is teachers with high emotional intelligence, they're better at setting a positive emotional tone.
And that helps students.
Significantly. It enhances student well-being and, importantly, social cohesion in the classroom. Everyone feels a bit more connected, a bit safer.
Okay, given how deeply a teacher's emotional state can affect students, what about that classic idea, the Pygmalion effect? Teacher expectations.
Ah, yes, the Pygmalion effect. It's absolutely a cornerstone here. That original study back in '68 showed pretty unequivocally how teacher expectations can profoundly boost or, well, depress student performance.
Just based on what the teacher believes.
Largely, yes. And what's even more critical now is understanding how teachers' implicit biases, those unconscious assumptions we all carry, especially around things like race, gender, socioeconomic background, how those can unconsciously change things.
Like what kinds of things?
Like the amount or type of attention they give certain students, the quality of the feedback they offer, even their disciplinary practices. It can all be subtly shaped by these hidden biases.
Wow. And students pick up on this.
Absolutely. Longitudinal studies consistently show that students internalize these teacher expectations over time. It directly affects their academic self-concept, how they see themselves as learners, and their motivation to even try.
So if a teacher isn't even aware of these biases, I mean, how can we even start to address this practically in a classroom? And thinking bigger picture, given how much these expectations and biases matter, what does this tell us about creating a genuinely safe space for every student?
That's the critical question. It means we absolutely need to cultivate what's called psychological safety.
Meaning students feel safe to mess up.
Exactly. It's a climate where students feel genuinely safe to express themselves, to ask questions, to take risks, without fearing embarrassment or punishment. When you have that safety,
Learning happens.
right, it encourages exploration, it fosters creativity, it builds resilience. Think about it. If you're constantly worried about being wrong or judged, you tend to shut down, right?
Makes sense.
And on the flip side, an authoritarian or overly punitive teaching style that can significantly increase student anxiety, lead to disengagement, and unfortunately prioritize just conforming over real creativity.
This connection between emotions, safety, and learning, it gets even deeper when we look at the neuroscience, doesn't it? Let's talk about brain-to-brain synchrony.
Yes, this is truly remarkable stuff. Neuroimaging research, actually looking at brains in action, has shown that there's synchronization of neural activity, specifically certain brain waves, alpha and gamma waves, between teachers and students during effective instruction.
Their brains are literally syncing up.
Literally syncing up. And what's more, this synchrony directly correlates with better learning outcomes, higher retention of information, deeper comprehension, and more positive emotional engagement. It's a concrete neurological marker of effective teaching and learning.
That physical synchronization is just incredible. So, okay, this isn't just about feeling good. It's measurable brain activity tied to learning.
Yeah.
How does that connect to something like cognitive load theory?
Good connection. Think of cognitive load theory in terms of mental bandwidth. Extraneous cognitive load is like mental static or clutter effort spent on things other than the actual learning task.
Like being stressed or confused.
Exactly. Now, those emotionally supportive teacher behaviors, we've talked about affirmations, maybe using humor appropriately. Encouragement, they actually work to reduce that extraneous cognitive load for students.
Okay, so it clears up mental space.
Precisely. It allows students to better use their working memory for the actual learning. You can think of it as emotional scaffolding. It clears away some of that mental noise, helps anchor attention. And this is especially helpful for students dealing with things like anxiety or ADHD.
So, okay, we have all this fascinating insight, the emotional links, the neuroscience. Let's talk about real-world applications. What interventions are actually making a difference in classrooms based on these ideas?
Great question. There's some really promising examples. The empathetic discipline study is a fantastic one.
What did that involve?
Teachers were trained in more empathetic practices, trying to understand the why behind student behavior. And the results? Suspension rates dropped by over 50%.
Wow, 50%.
Yeah. And at the same time, student trust and compliance actually improved. So it's not about being permissive, it's about connecting and teaching differently.
Okay.
Then you have social emotional learning, or SEL programs. These aren't just, feel-good exercises. Data consistently shows they improve academic outcomes and teacher-student relationships.
So it helps the learning, too.
Definitely. And here's a bonus. Teachers who participate in SEL training for themselves, they actually report lower rates of burnout. So it helps sustain the teachers, which helps everyone.
That's crucial. Anything else?
And finally, we're seeing real benefits from things like feedback loops and restorative practices. For instance, using student perception surveys, actually asking students about their experience, helps teachers adapt their methods. And restorative justice approaches focus on repairing harm and giving students a voice when things go wrong, rather than just punishment. This tends to decrease discipline disparities, too.
Okay, so bringing all these insights together, the student impact, the teacher impact, the neuroscience, the practical interventions, what does this all mean for policy and practice? How do we apply this systemically?
Right. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we scale this understanding? There are a few key recommendations that emerge.
Let's hear them.
First, teacher preparation programs. They really need a fundamental rethink. It can't just be about teaching methods. They need solid training in child and adolescent psychology, like understanding why kids act the way they do.
Beyond just classroom management tricks.
Exactly. Plus, practical skills in spotting and addressing implicit bias, developing their own emotional intelligence and stress regulation, and, crucially, trauma-informed pedagogy. Understanding how adversity impacts learning is vital.
Okay, that's prep programs. What about once teachers are in school?
Second, institutional supports are key. Schools themselves need to actively promote mental health literacy for staff and students. They need to provide strong mentoring and peer support networks, especially for new teachers, to combat that burnout we talked about.
Makes sense.
And implement ongoing feedback loops. Imagine systems where student input is regularly gathered and actually used to help teachers reflect and adapt.
That would be a shift.
A big one. And third, we probably need to redefine success metrics.
Moving beyond just test scores.
Pretty much. Shifting away from that heavy reliance on standardized tests towards more holistic models. Models that actually value emotional, social, and ethical development alongside academics. We should be incorporating well-being indicators for both students and teachers right into how we measure school performance. Success shouldn't just be scores. It should include well-being.
Okay, so to sort of wrap up our deep dive today, the big takeaway seems to be that education is way more than just transmitting information. It's this really dynamic two-way street.
Absolutely.
A constant exchange, emotional, cognitive, behavioral. We've seen how student attitudes, their motivation, their very presence profoundly shapes how teachers teach. And at the same time, the teacher's emotional state, their beliefs, their expectations, those profoundly shape who students become in that classroom, how they behave, how they perform. It's this continuous loop.
It really is. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Adopting a psychologically informed approach to education. One that's really grounded in what we know from neuroscience, from cultural competence research, from understanding emotional intelligence well. It isn't just some lofty ideal.
It's necessary.
It's truly essential if we want to create learning environments that are genuinely equitable and allow everyone involved, students and teachers, to really thrive. Maybe think about how these insights shift your own view of what makes for a great learning experience, whether you're a teacher, a student, a parent, or just, learning something new yourself.